Hi, good evening, everybody, once again, and thank you for joining another of our. I think we're nearly on a spring webinar now. It's certainly in North Lincolnshire today. We've had a little bit of warmth and a glimpse of the sun, so maybe we're heading towards spring, which would be nice. So, welcome to this evening's webinar. Tonight's theme is the Dartmoor Review, the conclusions and impact for other protected sites. And once again, it's really good to be able to use these webinars as an opportunity to get some of the really big hitters in the agricultural environment to join us. And we're lucky enough to have David Fursdon, who I'm sure many of you will know, chaired the Dartmoor Review, and also takes on a lot of other roles across the agricultural, horticultural sector, including chairing Dyson Farming. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with David's work. He's a big supporter of the TFA, so it's great to have David here, and thank you for joining us tonight, David. We've also got Helen Radmore, who many of you will also know. She's currently the TFA Junior Vice Chairman and Treasurer, and will be moving up later this month to take on the Vice Chair's role. And Helen farms with her husband on Dartmoor with a mixture of cattle, sheep and ponies. Her family have been a member of the TFA for 30 years, for over 30 years, and she's served as the Regional Chair for Devon and Cornwall, and has done an absolutely sterling job representing the TFA's uplands interests, both locally in and around Dartmoor and Devon, but also nationally for a number of years. And certainly Helen's ability to understand and represent Tenant's views in the uplands, I think, has been really key within a lot of the work that we have done with the TFA and is ongoing, obviously, with DEFRA. So we're really lucky to have both David and Helen with us this evening. And George Dunn will join us for the Q&A session. George, I don't think needs any introduction. You'll know George is the CEO of the organisation, so it's really good to have George along with us as well. Just a couple of things before we start. The usual sort of admin. The webinar will be recorded as usual, and once it's been edited, it will be available on the TFA YouTube channel, as are all of the webinars that we've run over time, and many of you will know some of the topics that we've covered. Most recently around ELMS and SFI, landlord-tenant relationships, new entrants, and most recently into soil carbon. So there's a lot of different stuff on there, and it's well worth going back if you weren't able to join us for those in the past. Also, pleased to say that the webinar is once again sponsored by Oxbury Bank. I don't think they are quite the new kids on the block anymore, and we're very grateful to have their sponsorship as ever. They were founded in 2021. They're the only specialist agricultural bank, and they reached over £1 billion in deposits in 2023. So I think that really is testament to what they're offering and the new thing that they're bringing to finance in the agricultural sector. So it's really good to have Oxbury on board with us once again for this webinar. And the final thing is, if I could just encourage you, if you have questions that you'd like us to ask, we've had a few sent in as ever prior to the event. There's a Q&A button it's on the bottom of my screen. It'll be somewhere on your screen. If you could use the Q&A section for asking questions rather than the chat, that would be really good, and we'll try and pick up as many of those as we can as the Q&A session goes on. So I think without further ado, we'll get cracking with the theme of the evening. As I say, we're talking about the Dartmoor Review, the conclusions and impacts for other protected sites, and I'm going to hand over to David Fursdon, who, as I say, chaired the review, to give us his view on the review, I guess, and what impact it's having. So thank you very much, David, for joining us, and we look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thank you very much, Mark, and good evening, everybody. you can see how much I love the TFA because I've dressed up for the occasion. But it also happens to be the only way I can get back into the Farmers Club later on. So don't think it's don't take me too seriously on that. But it is really good to be with you. The TFA I've worked with on and off for many years now, and I've really enjoyed that working relationship. And I'd also like to thank you as an organisation for your constructive contributions to the review. So take us back a few months now, and the air was getting quite blue around Dartmoor, with really what was developing into quite a difficult set of relationships based around grazing livestock. And I saw the review coming. I saw the Westminster Hall debate, which kicked this off, and I suddenly had, as it sometimes happens, that awful dawning feeling that I might have to do something in it, and I was persuaded to take on the role of chair. I don't quite know why I did it, but I thought maybe we needed to do it. Somebody needed to do it. So, and I've had an interesting few months, to be honest with you. This was about the end of June, and I don't know if any of you have been involved in these processes. They take quite a long time, and they have a sort of mind of their own, really. So although I've been asked about doing the role, the actual appointment took about 3 or 4 weeks to come through. We were already eating into the time that we were meant to be doing the review. I had to, because I am also Lord of Tenant at Devon, I had to do various clearances. I had to clear things with the Duchy, I had to clear things with Buckingham Palace and the Cabinet Office and so on. But they were happy for me to go ahead and do it. So I did. And my knowledge of Dartmoor was really about, we do as a family own a very small part of the common on Dartmoor. We're not active owners, we are passive owners, but we do own a little bit. So I made sure avoided any of the work that might give me a conflict of interest about owners of commons and commoners and people grazing the common. I'd worked for Stags as an equity partner for a number of years in the past, so I had met a lot of people who farm on Dartmoor, so I knew them quite well. I'd also been involved in 10 tours on the moor, and I'd spent 16 years on the Duchy Rural Committee who deals with the moor. So I tried to leave all those behind and to ensure that I wasn't in any way going to be biased in what I did. And I also knew various people. I knew people in the Dartmoor National Park Authority, in Natural England. I knew the farmers. So I sort of had a reasonable background, I guess. So we then, after a rather bizarre meeting with, my first meeting with the then Secretary of State, Therese Coffey, was at a reception in Buckingham Palace, where she saw my name badge and so talked to me a bit about how I might do this. And again, they were trying to talk about how I would do it as chair. And that discussion went on for quite a while. And then when I eventually got appointed, I then had to appoint the panel. And the panel was, I tried to select a panel that wasn't Dartmoor based. 1 or 2 people knew Dartmoor, but they weren't actually engaged in these activities on Dartmoor, farming and so on. And I tried to bring in a wide range of people from around the rest of the country. The problem with that, of course, was that it was very difficult to get everyone together at the same time, because I had people in York and people in the Lake District and people who lived in Cumbria and Gloucestershire and everywhere. But we got together either online or together or in groups as much as we could, and we produced it. We had one member of staff, Simon Lunis, some of you would know him, He works for the RPA and has a background on Dartmoor. Previously, he's worked for the NFU. And we had an interesting get together of the panel to decide how we were going to make this work. We really wanted to talk to people and hear what they had to say. We had 155 bits of written evidence, and we engaged probably with about 180 people one way and another. About 40 people came and gave us, put themselves up for interview as well. And it was pretty flat out at the end. We were given a bit of an extension, but at the end of the day, we had about 3 months, I suppose, and we had one member of staff. And it just amuses me to see that DEFRA are taking about 5 months to respond and have got 5 people working on the government response. So we'll see what happens with that. The evidence, there's a huge range of views that we had, but there were some common themes, I suppose, that came through. A frustration with Natural England and the process was one, and a lot of people brought that up. I think there was a lack of evidence and transparency and engagement, and I think getting the messages around Dartmoor seemed to be more difficult than people wanted it to be. It was difficult for the Commons associations, and they had, by the time the thing had been told 3 or 4 times, the message had changed, and not everybody was aware of what was going on. There was frustration that the payment rates hadn't been changed for quite a long time for the HLS schemes on Dartmoor. There were disagreements amongst some commoners as to how things should be done going forward. There was challenges with straying livestock, which actually meant that you were actually being penalised for other people's stock overgrazing your bit of the common or your common because they'd come over the hill from somewhere else. Nobody really got behind a vision for what they wanted Dartmoor to be. And there was a declining amount of grazable land. That was really the key thing. With the gorse spreading and the Molinia grass spreading, which for those of you who don't know is a purple moor grass, it meant that the actual amount of area that could be grazed by livestock was less and less, and not surprisingly, therefore it was getting more and more grazed. And that challenge about how the grazing should work became a real bone of contention. I think those were the frustrations from the farming bodies. There were frustrations from the conservation bodies as well. I think they were frustrated that some farmers were seeing the decline of the BPS and were hanging on to the HLS as a sort of alternative funding stream for the challenges of farming on Dartmoor. And my God, there are challenges of farming on Dartmoor. But actually, because it was HLS and not BPS, there were other things attached to it that needed doing, and they didn't feel that the farmers were engaged with that particularly. I think they were frustrated with the fact that stock weren't shepherded as closely as they might have been. But of course, it's a challenge to shepherd stock on Dartmoor for all the reasons that we know. They themselves didn't like the spread of Molinia, I don't think, because in Natural England, because it was suppressing alternative species in its march across the moor. And there was they wanted farmers to calve at different times of the year and have grazing. They wanted cattle out there in the summer, which actually wasn't what the farmers wanted to do. It was difficult for the Dartmoor Commoners Council because part of their role is meant to be enforcing some of this, and that was really hard when you have an elected body acting on behalf of the commoners. And Natural England were worried about peat as well, and they were also worried about their own position as the government's advisor. They were worried a bit, although not that much, but they were slightly concerned about having a judicial review of their performance. The government targets were all about the condition of triple SIs, and that's how they were being judged. They were being expected to uphold the law around triple SIs as well. And so they were worried about how they were going to be doing that. And I think the combination of those two things, frustrations on the farm, the frustration for Natural England, boiled over, and it was a question of what was going to happen then. So what were our conclusions? I'm not going to go through them now because you will have read them in the report, or you're able to do that. But we felt that we were at a bit of a crossroads. The climate is warming up. That brings with it disease, water, rain, more rain, and disease and pests, and a change actually in the plant life on the moor. We wanted to go. We had a strong argument that commoning and pastoralism have an important role, and Dartmoor absolutely needs to be grazed. So what was the vision? How was that going to happen? And we didn't come up with some magic bullet that nobody else had thought of, but we just tried to have a series of incremental changes that might change the atmosphere of the discussion on the moor and the outcomes. There was so much that none of us knew. And even I had 4 ecologists, academics on my panel. They didn't all agree. There was so much we don't know about what the climate's really doing, what the impact of that climate is on plants on the moor, on animal, on pest and disease, on ticks. What about carbon emissions? What about carbon sequestration? There's a lot of talk, not a lot of evidence. There's discussions about burning, swaling. Should it happen? Shouldn't it happen? What should the rules be? Where's the objective evidence? What about layering or hefting? What about atmospheric pollution on the moor from nitrogen? What were the triple SIs like originally, when they were originally designated? How much have they changed? Where's the records of what that change has been? What is the heather reacting to heather beetle? Is it reacting to grazing, and so on? And there were loads of bodies too, all with a vested interest, all on the moor. And I won't read them off, you know them all. So that was what we were facing. And I think our conclusion was that a number of small changes needed to be made, and people needed to change their behavior. And we tried to come up with some conclusions that actually provided a space for dialogue and a space for evidence and a space for understanding of the role of the other players in this difficult situation, and see where we would go from there. So what happens next? On Friday, we've got the Secretary of State coming down to Dartmoor. I will be meeting him there. I had a briefing with him 10 days ago. So we've looked, I've tried to explain the challenge of what we were trying to face in the review, and why we produced the answers that we did, and to explain that there were reasons for those recommendations, because they tied in a number of the other things we've been saying and hearing. And actually, if you cherry pick bits out of it, it's much more difficult to get an outcome that everybody might want. We don't know when we're going to get the government response. I'll be quite interested to see what the Secretary of State feels that he can say. And also, I think Marion Spain, the Chief Executive of Natural England, is coming down as well. It'll be interesting to see what they say in advance of the formal government response to our review. What do I think the government will say? I think the government are basically, I think DEFRA are basically supportive of quite a lot of what we've put in our review. Whether they're going to have the courage to actually take those steps, however, I don't really know. They are quite risk averse. And some of the things we're going to suggest are a reasonable change. For example, we're going to change how we look at triple SIs. how we record them, how we look at the changes that there are to these sites of special scientific interest, and how that should happen. Uh, what are they going to think about that? These, Natural England, it's part of the way they're being judged, whether the SSSIs are in favourable condition. The definition of favourable condition, what's it really mean? And what plants are they trying to get to, and what plants did they have originally? And what about the impact on other species, bird life, for example? You get into all sorts of esoteric discussions about whether dung beetles, feed on the droppings of sheep, are actually a food source for birds or not. So, the whole thing is terribly interwoven. But we felt that the SSSI process needed to be looked at. We weren't allowed to recommend any legislation changes, but we were prepared. Weren't prepared not to say that the SSSI process needs another look. The data, there isn't enough data on Dartmoor about some of the stuff is translated from elsewhere in the country. Dartmoor is further south. It's warmer. It's wetter, and I think we wanted to set up a process that would actually glean evidence of what burning is like. I mean, the commoners were frightened of a burn getting out of control, because the worry then would be that they would be fined for breach of their agreements, and that gets heavy, and then you start getting threatening letters and so on. We wanted to set up a land use group that actually was prepared to do some testing, was prepared to look at some risk taking, trying to build up a database, have it available as an observatory of data available on Dartmoor for anybody that wants to see it, and look at different ways of doing things and what would come up from that. That group is a pretty key part of our recommendations, and that group is designed to have people discussing some of this stuff before it gets too late. So if Natural England are going to be wanting to see something done differently on Dartmoor, then we hope that that will come to this land use group, independently chaired, objectively chaired, where the farmers can make their point, and Natural England can make their point, and there can be a proper debate about it, the evidence on the table, people understanding it, and actually try and take the heat out of some of that. Is this a key opportunity now? It probably is. I don't see that government are going to do anything again on this in a hurry. I mean, yes, the evolution of the schemes is changing. We are quite keen on a Dartmoor-wide scheme, so that the straying and the stock coming over from elsewhere and so on are all dealt with in a way that is holistic. We feel that that should go with a Dartmoor-wide agri-environment scheme as well. I think that that could solve some of the problems that we have seen, but we will see. Of course, we've now got landscape recovery as well. And if we're not careful, we'll divide a wedge between a whole lot of people, with some people in landscape recovery and some people not, and some people having different rules and so on. So there needs to be this overall view about it. And this land use group that I'm talking about is possibly the one to do this. And this is not decrying the Commons associations and the Commoners Council, who have a very difficult job to do and under a lot of pressure. And we feel that they need to be helped in doing that role as well. There is a shortage of government money. We're always aware of that. The schemes that are being developed need to take account in more detail of commoning, because it's a different process from what has happened hitherto. And trying to squeeze commoning into templates that are created for the rest of the country is never really going to work, in my view. So can we do things without government and without government money? Not easily, but we've got, I think, as an industry, to try and make something work better, and so that we don't go back to what we had before. And, incredibly upset farmers, families writing passionately to me as part of the review, really on edge about the whole thing. and indeed also some commoners being unacceptably rude to Natural England and one or two individuals trying to do their job. Yes, mistakes were made by Natural England, but I'd like to get it back to a situation where we can talk to each other and actually do it properly. Yes, you can produce food and you can look after the environment. And the farmers have got to show that they are prepared to look after the environment as well as grow food. And the standoff had got to a stage where they didn't trust anybody and they weren't prepared to do that. I think we've got to get back to that situation where the land can do both. So I think I've probably used up my time and gone over it. So I'm not going to say any more. I know Helen's going to come in now, and then we'll have a Q&A, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. Thanks very much.
David, thank you for that. Really interesting, and your comments about so much of that, and really interaction between farming and the environment goes so much across the whole of the industry, I think, at the moment, but it's clearly particularly relevant in environments such as Dartmoor. So really good to hear, and the conclusions. Obviously disappointing, I guess, that we haven't had a response from government, and we don't know when we may get that. And hopefully you might sounds like you might find something about that on Friday, perhaps. But
I hope to. I'm going to ask the question, Mark. So
yeah,
yes.
Absolutely. It often seem to be the way when these reviews go ahead very quickly that the response is less rapid. But yeah, let's hope we get some response soon. So anyway, we're going to move on, and Helen Radmore, who I say is about to become our vice chair, and farms up on Dartmoor, and Helen's just going to give us a bit of an oversight now of the current situation on Dartmoor and how she sees, as somebody farming in that environment, how the review may help or perhaps hinder. Helen, we don't know. Let's move on to Helen. So thanks very much for joining us, Helen. Over to you.
Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to thank David and his panel for all the work and the incredible amount of evidence they must have gone through in a short time. So I think everyone on Dartmoor does thank David and his panel. I do hope that looking at the review that we take on everything, because like David said, we need to take on everything, not bits of it. We cannot pick and choose. Could I have the first slide? This is hefted to the hills, which most farmers believe they are hefted to the hills as well as their stock. From this picture, you can see that we've got the next generation and the next generation all out, all learning the skills of Dartmoor, and all wanting to take forward what the review is offering us. This might be sheep here that we're looking at, but we all have cattle, sheep, ponies. Different areas need to be grazed. The current situation is still quite tense on Dartmoor. We have got some new faces within Natural England, and yes, they have made a tremendous effort to move around and talk to different areas. We've had some really good reports from some of the commoners associations that have spoken to the new people. There is several commons that have now had a second rollover going on from last year. So now they're covered into 2025. So hopefully during this time, we'll be able to find a really good way forward, farming with the environment to keep our farms viable. We desperately need to know that our next generation will be there. Next slide, please. Here we have Molinia, purple moorgrass, that has grown exponentially since the HLSs came into being. When we started with ESAs, a lot of our cattle were cleared. And when we started with an HLS, they wanted more cattle back and wanted to clear the sheep. Now, most farmers will have a good overview and there should be no knee-jerk reactions. We need to hurry slowly. This picture here comes from the Farming Futures programme when we were using cattle to trample Molinia in the autumn. So we're probably late October, beginning of November. But it is hard work, it takes time. But the cattle did make a difference. And we're now looking to take this forward, being able to use potentially no-fence collars to actually, we really need to tackle the Molinia. In different parts of Dartmoor, it is the gorse that is the scourge. And that is going to be so difficult to tackle because as soon as you attack it, it sends out and grows bigger. But we have to find how to manage these things. We need to follow the science. Now, as David mentioned, the dung beetle, it has been found that the dung beetle is a part of grazing sheep. Sheep are not the enemy. They are one of our tools. We've also found that the resistance to tick infection is also lost when the sheep and the cattle, but particularly the sheep, are removed over winter. And when they return to the moor, not only does it damage their heft, which creates straying, but they also lose this resistance to ticks. Now, between 10 and 50% is reported of tick losses from their sheep. We know from advances in medicine and the Morden Institute that they are looking at sheep to be vaccinated to protect the humans and their dogs that are enjoying the commons. So we must never take a knee-jerk reaction to anything we do, and we need to look at cattle, sheep and ponies. Next slide, please. Right, elms. We've got lots of things that we are expected to do. The public goods. This might not look like a public good, but this integrates the owners, commoners, people that work with commoners. This is obviously showing the water, which we all want. And there's the slow the flow. But we're also asked to produce an awful lot of things under the public good. And we have to have this mosaic. If we have Molinia and we have gorse and we have bracken, we do not have a mosaic. We need to work, like David said, with the land use management group, so we can actually examine what evidence there is within this group in a safe area, so we can actually explore things. It had become quite adversarial with Natural England, which is a shame. Everybody has a job to do, but it was just not working for Dartmoor. A lot of the science came from upcountry. Yes, the triple SIs had failed, but had they failed because the citations were aspirational, or were they what was actually there? There is so much science coming out now. The extra rainfall we have, the temperature, the nitrogen deposition. I mean, we probably don't need to use fertilizer anymore because we have got nitrogen deposition raining all over the place. But we need to move on. We all need to work together, and we need to know that next generation is going to be there, because once the skills have lost and once people have left Dartmoor, they won't be coming back. Next slide, please. This was a fire break. Now, the Molinia and the gorse and bracken creates a huge fuel load. The fire brigade are very nervous of the fuel load on Dartmoor. They would like to see large fire breaks, not necessarily burning them, but they could be cut. But they do need to be the width of double roads. Otherwise, when the gorse is burning, you cannot stop them. And we'll lose far more through a large fire like we had in 2019 than we'll ever lose through grazing animals. those animals will graze, they will break the thatch, they will open up the diversity, we will get a lot more. But we need to work together. We really need to work together. I think I'm covering most of what, but we mustn't lose our skills. Next slide, please. The MOD. We have training on Dartmoor across lots of places at Dartmoor. So yet it is another area. We have to do unexploded ordnance surveys for extra work we need to do up there. But it is, again, part and parcel of all the things that Dartmoor offers. And we have to get all of these things and all the priorities and the viable farming and the good food, the food we produce is farming with the environment. So I will defend my grazing. I will work with Dartmoor. I will work with Natural England. I will work with anybody to take Dartmoor forward for the better of everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. That's a really good kind of, I think, a really good summary of where you are and what the current state of play is really. And I suppose there's a couple of things to pick up from what you said. That I guess it's encouraging that there has been a bit of a change of attitude with Natural England, and that's to be welcomed. And as with so much of what's going on, I think in the industry right across the board, this theme of farmers, landowners, tenants, environmental bodies working together and collaborating is absolutely key, and probably more than ever in an environment like you've got on Dartmoor, where there are just so many competing pressures, if you like, to deliver for the environment, but also to produce food and so on. So I think it's really evident that there are a lot of different issues at stake here, but without sensible collaboration from all the bodies, it's very difficult to come up with a, if you like, a sensible and workable solution. So let's move on to a few questions. I'd just bring George in at this point to join us on the Q&A. Here we go. Yeah, thanks, George. I guess one thing perhaps I could just kick off with, which has been raised by both David and Helen, is the role of the land use group on Dartmoor. I mean, in particular, perhaps just touching on the issues around commons here, how you would see, David, you mentioned about having a kind of environmental scheme for Dartmoor rather than the presumably traditional individual parcels, if you like, or individual farms having their own schemes. I wonder how you would see such a thing working. I can see a lot of benefit in it, but I can also see maybe quite a lot of challenges from trying to bring various different commons together, different farms, different ownership models. But maybe it's a very good solution. So I just wonder if both of you could give us a bit of a view on how that might actually work in practice.
It seems to us that the overall grazing on the moor needs to be balanced to the number of livestock that are trying to graze it. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And you basically need to get rid of some of the unpalatable grass like Molinia in order to have a balance between a proper stocking rate and the proper vegetation cover. And if you do it in little bits and pieces, and then you have rows about somebody else's stock coming over and grazing it, and then what about the different situations? You will always have different commons with different habitats and different things that you want to look after. But we felt that a lot of this would be removed. A lot of the aggro would be removed if we had one overall scheme. Now, we weren't brave enough, nor did we have any time to try and design what that scheme might look like. But we felt that if we tried to put in place the mechanisms for the discussion of some of these difficult issues, we felt that that was for discussion between the RPA, between Natural England, and probably between the land use group on Dartmoor, which would have on it representatives from Natural England and also from the commoners as well. So yeah, there'd be everybody's getting their heads together to look at the practicalities. And if you've got the other bodies like the RPA also involved, they can say what's practical and what isn't and what's going to work. But we felt it was well worth looking and making a serious effort to try and make that happen.
Thanks, David. Helen, how would you see something like that working at a practical level as for farmers on the moor?
I think it would need some extra facilitation, obviously, but I do agree that if you had grazing set over the whole of Dartmoor, you would stop creating these vacuum areas where stock was moving. It could be going into someone else's common, which causes animosity between two commoners when there's no borders. So I think if we did have a much larger area, it might end up that we're in quarters. But we've proved that through the Forest of Dartmoor, which is about 10,000 hectares, and we've got management groups within that. And I think I definitely think it could work, and it will be better, and we'll all have the same vision.
Yeah, and vision was something was touched on before, was actually having that vision for the whole of Dartmoor, I guess, which is interesting. George, I wonder how that would affect specifically tenant issues, or how would that play out if there was a sort of Dartmoor wide scheme going on? How would you see that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with David and Helen that the aspiration should be to do something at the widest scale possible, because we are talking really about an open landscape, and you need to make sure that you are managing that open landscape in accordance with its characteristics, which is as an open landscape. And I fear that we have seen Natural England taking the line of least resistance by trying to take part common approaches across Dartmoor to just get some schemes up and running. But as Helen used the phrase, it's been creating a vacuum because stock are just going into those areas. And we're now seeing Natural England trying to use the threat of stop notices on certain parts of the common to try and protect the dwarf shrub and the acid grassland that exists there. And I think there is also a lack of understanding within Natural England about the various levels of occupation that exist. So we have owners, we have tenants, we've got graziers, we've got graziers that are grazing common rights, we've got graziers who are grazing landlord's surplus, we've got graziers who are grazing landlord's proportion, and all of those people need to be brought into the mix here and a greater understanding of that. So I think David's aspiration of having a land use group trying to do something at a Dartmoor level is the right one. We may not get it at such a wide level, but we must do something at the widest scale possible so that everybody gets a chance to take part in the management of the future of Dartmoor.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I'll just pick up on perhaps the role of Natural England here. You've touched on that, George, in your answer there, and certainly David at the start around where the Dartmoor Review perhaps kind of was instigated and how it came about. I wonder if you could all comment a little bit on whether we've had a question from a member in Devon who's asking whether Natural England should have their wings clipped, and that rather than DEFRA operate an appeal system around Natural England decisions on SSSI's consent, DEFRA should actually be responsible for deciding the consent in the first instance. But I wonder more broadly whether you feel that Natural England are the right body to manage these kind of environments that we're talking about on Dartmoor, or whether it's simply the methodology that they're using. You've certainly all, David and Helen, both touched on evidence and data. and the difference between Dartmoor and perhaps where some of that data and evidence is being used from further north in the country. So there seems to be a sort of a lack of evidence as to back up what some of the management is being asked to deliver. And I just wonder whether Natural England is the right body to manage these environments, and how you feel that might change, or whether they just need to change and they are the right body.
Mark, maybe I could kick off on that one to begin with, because I think David will probably have to be a little bit diplomatic about what he says here, given his role and his forthcoming discussions with the Secretary of State. But I think from the TFA's perspective that there is a real issue with Natural England's performance in terms of the management and improvement of the protected landscape on Dartmoor. We've had 30 years of agri-environment schemes on Dartmoor managed by Natural England, or certainly advised by Natural England and its predecessor bodies. And here we are today talking about an environment that hasn't improved to the extent we wanted to have improved, and yet we've thrown lots of public money at it. And I think the problem here is that the approach that's been taken to date has not been the right approach, because we've been too much focused on reducing livestock numbers rather than dealing with the wider panoply of issues in play, including getting better grazing management, greater shepherding across the piece. And I think actually the predecessor Secretary of State, George Eustice, had it right, that these are decisions that different ministers should be taking. And David sort of alluded to this in his report, that the governance structure within which these decisions are made and policies are decided need to be given back to ministers, and Natural England can provide advice to ministers about how these things are taken forward. But ultimately, it's a decision for ministers to decide how these schemes are developed and go forward. So to that extent, I do think that Natural England probably needs to have its wings clipped and become the advisor that it was intended to be, rather than the judge, jury, and executioner that it has been, and without ostensibly any massive benefit for the environment. So I think there is work to be done there.
Thanks, George. David, do you want to make a diplomatic comment?
Well, I mean, I think it's not. It's quite difficult, because Natural England are expected to report on the outcomes. They're expected to be the guardians of the SSIs. They aren't set up to be somebody who actually also has to make sure that all the ways of dealing with it are the best that they possibly are, because they don't have that influence. And so I think they have a bit of a challenge. I think it's all quite difficult, and the ways in which condition assessments have been done, been done like this for quite a while, and everyone's got into the pattern of doing it in a particular way. As we focus more and more on judging them by the condition of SSIs, I would have thought they would want to have some changes to the way the whole system works, because otherwise they are going to be, always marked up to fail. Because what is the condition of SSIs right across the country? It's not as good as it should be, and there are so many other factors in play here. So someone's got to do this role. I don't think that. I think the danger can be that DEFRA, judge and executioner, instead of Natural England. If there is no, it's quite good to have an alternative appeal system. If something's not working in one place, have somebody else look at it. So it's a difficult balance. And you're right, George, to say that it is really ministers that have to decide how this should work best. But I personally would be disappointed if we end up all of this without looking at the process around SSIs and how they actually are dealt with and monitored and scored, and who takes the decision, because I just think it's right for a bit more discussion, as indeed George Eustice's paper had, the green paper that he produced.
Thanks, David. Helen, did you want to add anything on the role Natural England of where they fit in, if you like, in this maybe?
I'm just concerned as a commoner and grazier that they've got a very narrow view of what they're looking at, and we need a much wider view, because they might say one thing and they'll destroy something else. And that is where we have to be able to have discussion and be valued. Farmers need to feel valued for their discussion. And also, we really need to celebrate achievement. That is never done within Commons, Dartmoor, Natural England. We need to celebrate when we get it right and learn. I don't think we're learning from the mistakes of the last 30 years. And we need to. We need to protect in the next 50 or 100 years of our triple SIs and what we can save with climate change and everything else that's going on.
Mark,
Yeah.
could I just
Yeah,
say,
absolutely, David. Yeah.
could I just say well done to Helen, because I think saying that about celebrating what works, and actually people feeling proud of what they've actually done that's worked well, farmers, doing something that really does deliver for the country and for the environment and for as well as their own grazing. So I think that's right. And I think the other point that Helen was making was that we need to be able to discuss these things. That was the point of the group. A place to discuss these things that is safe, where no one's going to fine you or attack you for what you have to say. I think that's what we need, and that can only happen if you have transparency and all the stuff out on the table for everybody to see.
Yeah. I'll just pick up. I'll apologise already, because once again our hour seems to have flown by and we're nearly at the end of it. I feel like I've hardly touched on any of the questions this evening, but we've had a very interesting discussion. One of the things that is coming up a lot, both in your comments and in one or two of the questions, is around the role of the triple SI. So I'll just sort of summarise this, and maybe we could just cover this one. Julie Robinson asks, do you think triple SIs have become a sacred cow, and there's a reluctance by government and Natural England to carry out a fundamental review of designations? And she also goes on to say, I'd mentioned about there needs to be a good level of collaboration across the place, but how can collaboration be done when the triple SIs are so prescriptive, if you like? So, and David, you certainly mentioned about that triple SIs have perhaps failed and really need a change as to how they are worked. I wonder, again, for the three of you, whether you could just comment on perhaps how we manage triple SIs and whether they are actually fit for purpose, and whether there's a better way of managing our environmental habitats.
One of the things I would say is that, we have a triple SIs with a boundary, and then over the boundary, it's not very different. And what's going on over the boundary affects what's happening on the triple SI. So in terms of grazing, for example, the Natural England want to see the right sort of grazing pattern on a triple SI, but then you can't on an open common. That's related to what the stock are doing right next door. So the whole thing is really difficult to get right. And I think if it's without a proper look at it, we're gonna find it really hard, however much we talk to each other, to actually get a solution to this. And I wouldn't be surprised if I think it's difficult for people to. I said I thought people were a bit risk averse. I'm hoping that someone is prepared to take the risk to actually look at this as part of the conclusions and the government response to what we said. Because I think if it was all meant to work together, if we leave that bit of it out, then it's going to make it very difficult to achieve some of the other things we want to achieve.
George, I would say, is it right that we should be identifying special bits of our landscape, special bits of our biodiversity that we want to be bothered to protect, enhance, and allow to thrive? Yes, of course we should. That's something as a nation we should be doing. But in saying that, drawing a line on a map has never done anything to assist with the process of assisting those landscapes and that biodiversity to thrive. We need to be thinking more holistically about what it is we need to do if we want to protect and enhance these sites And these SSIs have been around for a very long time, and there is a lack of clarity over what is considered to be good condition of those SSIs. And we even have language which says, unfavorable and declining if it doesn't happen to be the condition that is unfavorable and declining if it doesn't happen to be in an agri-environment scheme. And just because it is in an agri-environment scheme, it's suddenly characterized as being unfavorable but improving just because it's in a scheme. But we know that the last 30 years of agri-environment schemes hasn't really provided the enhancements that we need. So I absolutely agree with David. We need a fundamental review of the whole panoply of legislation and governance and regulation around SSIs. And we need to be much more focused on how we progress these sites rather than simply trying to restrict what goes on within a line on a map.
Yeah, no, I think that's line. Yeah, Helen.
I've got to agree. We've got to be braver. I mean, if you think we're looking at re-wetting at the moment, but without grazing re-wetting areas, it will dry again because the millennia is short-rooted and it takes the moisture from the top of the land. So we have to be braver in how we're looking at things, because the majority of these triple SIs fail because they're dominant of one plant or another. So we've got ungrazed, undergrazed, and small areas of overgrazed. So this is what we need to tackle. And I think we have to be brave how we tackle it. And we have to be, if we do things slightly wrong, we just have to say, that didn't work. Let's try something else. We have to find a way.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit in there, isn't there, about being braver about how we deal with a lot of this stuff, I think, and collaboration and working together to get the right answer. I'm going to just pick up one final question for this evening, and I hope all of those that have asked questions that haven't been asked, we will endeavour to answer the questions offline and put the answers onto our website. So please take a look at that after the webinar if you want. We've had a couple of questions, and I'll just, it's around this same thing. Jeremy Oti has asked, were the majority of issues you discussed specific to Dartmoor, or is it a sign that there are wider issues of a disconnect between farmers and the conservation bodies? And just to build on that, there's a couple of other comments. Viv Lewis from the Federation of Cumbrian Commoners saying what she's hearing tonight on Dartmoor is reflected also in Cumbria. So I wonder whether what we're actually doing with this review that you've done, David, whether this is actually going to have a lot of lessons for a lot of these types of environments across the country. And I wonder how you feel about how that should be led.
So I think there are some things that, particularly the stuff around triple SIs, which can be just as easily argued somewhere else in the country in the uplands as it is on Dartmoor. Some are more Dartmoor specific, the particular mix of what's going on Dartmoor, the factors that might be impacting on it may be slightly different, temperature change and so on. I hope that what this review does is give those in those other parts of the country the opportunity to study our recommendations and to think, are those things that they think would work, or are needed where they live and the experience that they're having. And if so, what I hope we will have is, well, we'll see what happens when the government responds. And if they were to pick up all our suggestions, I'd be absolutely delighted. I'd also be amazingly surprised. So I hope that bodies like the TFA will join with other bodies with influence and with access to government to not let it rest. If we get a lukewarm answer, I hope that there will be a robust pushback by bodies like the TFA if you feel that it's not adequate to answer what we really want to try and solve.
Yeah. Helen, what's your view? Do you think some of what's been said in the review is sort of can be rolled out to other areas, or how do you see that?
I think the principle of what's in the review can be rolled out to other areas. But like David said, Dartmoor is different. It's warmer, it's wetter. We had 650 mil of rain in the last month. So it's but there is a lot that can be transposed to other things. And I'm certain that with Viv and the fact that I've spoken to Viv on many occasions, that they do have the same type of issues with their SSSIs. And it depends on what Natural England project officer you've got sometimes, because they have their own likes and dislikes. So we do need to keep talking.
Thanks, Helen. George, did you want to have one final word?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Can I just say, as has already been said by Helen, a huge thanks to David and his team for grasping this particular nettle. The issues that were raised within Dartmoor were from brave individuals who were concerned enough to say that the system wasn't working and we need to do something differently. And if this does spark other areas to have the same type of bravery, then I think that's all to the good, because I think the common things that apply here are the way in which SSSIs are designated, the way in which you measure what's favourable and unfavourable condition, the governance of those SSSIs, the fact that there is common grazing on a lot of these upland SSSIs, which needs to be taken into consideration. So my view is there's a lot of learnings from Dartmoor that could be used in other parts of the country. And I will certainly take David's challenge to make sure that DEFRA doesn't put this one to bed too soon. And before I shut up, Mark, because I know you will let me say anything later, this is your last webinar as National Chair of the TFA. You have been the consistent voice of our webinar series since we launched them in the heat of COVID in 2020. You have been a phenomenal chair of these webinars, and you have created a library of information that's available to our members and the wider public forever on our YouTube channel. You've handled every subject with aplomb, even tonight when you didn't think you were able to add anything significantly. You've been a fantastic chair of the TFA, a fantastic chair of these webinars, and I'll hand back to you now to close.
Well, George, thank you very much. That's very kind of you to say so. What I'm not a very good, phenomenal chair at doing is actually finishing on time at any point. So I'll apologise in the first instance to everybody that's whose tea is going cold or whatever at the moment. But I think it is a testament to David for leading this review and completing it in what I think was pretty swift time, but also coming up with some really sensible conclusions, I believe. And it's really interesting to hear. I really take home from this that these reviews don't come up with something which is a piecemeal. You can have 0.1, 5 and 7 and then we do it. This needs to be done in its entirety, and you can rest assured, David, that I'm sure the TFA will be absolutely right behind you on trying to make sure that that is what the government do. So thank you, David, very much for attending this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen to you and to hear your thoughts on it. Helen, also, thank you for your contribution this evening, but perhaps more importantly, thank you for your contribution to everything on Dartmoor and to upland farmers and tenants in particular. You really are an absolute credit to for people that farm in those areas. So, and thank you very much for coming tonight and giving us your view on where we are and what needs to happen. A lot of common themes, I think, there around collaboration and cooperation and working together. So that's really good. Thank you, George, for your kind words. Obviously, this is my last webinar as chair. You'll be pleased to know that next month we have one on the benefit of Red Tractor to British farmers and growers. It's on the 25th of April, starts at 7 p.m. Will be chaired by the incoming TFA chairman, Robert Martin, whose timekeeping I hope will be a lot better than mine. But thank you all for attending this evening. A big thank you also, I mentioned earlier at the start of the webinar that Oxbury Bank have been sponsoring these for the last 15 months, I think even. But this is also their final webinar as the sponsor. But we're really pleased to announce that Roy Thorne's solicitors are going to sponsor our series of webinars starting next month. So a big thank you to them and a big thank you to Oxbury. I hope they've benefited from their sponsorship. We're really grateful for them being involved and to all those supporters that we have. So hopefully, we'll see a lot of you next month. And thank you for coming along this evening, and have a good evening.